Welcome to 10-Minute Record Reviews, episode 218. This time I'm going to talk about Gabor Szabo's debut on Impulse Records in 1966, Gypsy 66, backed up with Gary McFarland and company, it says. This is first Canadian pressing. In terms of what to expect, well, it's Gabor Szabo, who's kind of a one-off, so expect Gabor Szabo, but what is distinct about him, a variety of things. His pop sensibility, his mixing of his Hungarian background with jazz and pop and so on, but also his tone, which is maybe the first thing which leaps out, which is very trebly and has a lot of sustain. It comes from this basically setup, which you can see on the cover there, where he's got a Gibson acoustic on which he's using an electric pickup, and the signal from that is a little bit overdriven. Anyway, once you've heard it, it's unmistakable. Gabor Szabo is, of course, Hungarian. He was born in Budapest in 1936. He develops an interest in guitar as a teenager when he sees a movie starring Roy Rogers, who, of course, played the guitar in many of his movies. The following year, he got a guitar for Christmas, not a very good guitar, and he developed a fingering technique which was basically designed to compensate for the shortcomings of the fretboard of that guitar. Hungary, of course, was in the Soviet sphere of influence, and Szabo was able to hear jazz primarily through listening to broadcasts on the Voice of America, and particularly the show hosted by the DJ Willis Conover. Now, Conover is not that well known in the West, and even not that well known in the United States, in his country of origin, but he was hugely well known in Eastern Europe because he would broadcast jazz records, and he would give a lot of additional information about jazz, and he would speak in a very slow and clear manner, which allowed a lot of his English as a second language listeners to pick up what he was saying and to learn English in the process. Thanks to Conover, Szabo was exposed to players like Tal Farlow and Johnny Smith, and he began to copy their playing, eventually gigging in local clubs in and around Budapest. In 1956, when he was 20, of course, the Hungarian uprising happens, and it is about to be crushed by the Russians, and on the eve of the Russians coming in and putting down the revolt, Szabo and his girlfriend, or another friend, go over the border to Austria, and eventually he makes his way out to California. In LA, he starts a group called the Three Strings, which doesn't get a lot of work, so he decides he'd probably better get an education, so he heads off to Boston to go to the Berklee School of Music. He was only there for a year. He studied composition and arranging, but he makes some very good connections, including Bob James, who was Creed Taylor's arranger of choice all the way through the 1970s, and also Gary McFarland, another arranger and composer. He's invited to play at the 1958 Newport Jazz Festival as part of a group of international musicians which the festival wanted to showcase. He also meets Chico Hamilton. Now, Chico Hamilton had quite a well-regarded group playing out in California, and Szabo had actually heard them play and was a fan. And for his part, Hamilton had heard Szabo play at the festival and was impressed as well. That ends up being quite a fortuitous connection. By 1959, Szabo had discovered that being an immigrant guitarist living in Boston and going to school was not exactly economically sustainable, so he had to give up the Berklee School and go back to Los Angeles. There, he decided to look up Chico Hamilton. Hamilton had been featuring a guitarist in his group, a guy called John Pisano, but Pisano was leaving, and he recommended that Hamilton take Szabo on, and so Szabo gets a gig right away with a fairly top-level group. The lineup at the time, beyond Chico Hamilton on drums and Gabor Szabo on guitar, included Albert Stinson on bass, Garnett Brown on trombone, and Charles Lloyd on tenor sax. However, despite Hamilton's favorable first impression of Szabo, he decided he didn't like his playing, and so Hamilton fires Szabo. At that point, Lloyd also leaves the group to go and do some other work. Hamilton really wants him back and says, "Look, Charles, please come back to the group." And he says, "Well, I will come back, but only if you take that guitarist, the Hungarian guy, back into the group. I liked him." Against his better judgment, Hamilton does this, but things work out just great. There are some great records made by the Hamilton Quintet, which I really can't recommend highly enough. 1963's Man from Two Worlds is basically a vehicle for Lloyd's compositions and his playing. Unfortunately, at that point, he'd also largely outgrown the role of sideman, so he leaves, which was fortunate for Szabo, who now becomes basically the main sort of frontline talent in Hamilton's group. In '64, Downbeat votes him the talent most deserving of wider recognition. The next album the group puts out, Chic Chic Chico, is essentially a showcase for Szabo. In '65, although he was still continuing to record with Chico, Szabo goes to join Charles Lloyd as well in his quartet, which Lloyd has started up with Ron Carter on bass and Tony Williams on drums, which is one hell of a lineup. But all the way through this period, despite playing on all these great records with these great jazz players, Szabo's tastes are much more commercial and popular than those of his other bandmates, particularly Lloyd. And so at this point, re-entered Gary McFarland, who of course had been a colleague at the Berklee School of Music. McFarland had done a lot of work since he left school. One of his most significant early credits was as arranger on Stan Getz's 1963 record Big Band Bossa Nova, which is one of the 3 albums which he cut with Creed Taylor that really kickstarted the whole bossa nova craze. He'd done quite a successful sort of soft bossa record, kind of elevated music, sort of elevated music for Verve in 1964 called Soft Samba. Taylor had really liked that, and he said, Gary, can you put together a quintet and make some recordings? So McFarland reaches out to his old friend from school, Szabo, and says, did he want to join? And Szabo says, sure. This leads to a partnership which produces 7 excellent records between 1966 and 1970. And what these two share, McFarland and Szabo, is this interest in mashing up jazz and popular music. The very first of their collaborative efforts comes out under McFarland's name on Verve in 1966, and that's called The In Sound, which I highly recommend. Then Bob Thiele signs Szabo to Impulse Records, and the two of them make this record for Impulse, Gypsy 66. This is Gabor Szabo's solo debut. The producer of this record, somewhat enigmatically, is Bell Arts International, which I have to think is some kind of pseudonym. Normally for Impulse Records at the time, Bob Thiele would have produced almost everything. The engineer is Rudy Van Gelder, as on so many Impulse recordings. McFarland is the arranger. He also kicks in some marimba here and there. The lineup of songs is quite interesting. I mentioned the desire to mash up jazz and popular music, and that's exactly what they do here. There are 2 Beatles covers. There's 2 songs by Burt Bacharach. There are 2 songs by Gary McFarland himself, one by Szabo, and there's 1 movie soundtrack number. In addition to Szabo and McFarland, there are 2 different lineups, one for the first 3 tracks in the record and another for the last 6. Those making up the group on the first 3 tracks include Barry Galbraith on guitar, Al Stinson on bass, Willie Rodriguez on percussion, Grady Tate on drums, and Sadeo Watanabe on flute. There are 3 changes the rest of the way. Richard Davis replaces Stinson on bass, Francisco Pozo replaces Rodriguez on percussion, and Sam Brown adds a 3rd guitar. Side 1 starts with that niche, little-known Lennon and McCartney number, Yesterday. It works. It could be cheesy, but it works. The next song is a Bacharach and David tune, the last one to be loved, from a time when Bacharach songs were not just a byword for schlock. Again, something that could be cheesy, but actually works pretty well. Echo of Love is a McFarland tune, and here some of the other players start to take a more central role, including Watanabe again on flute and McFarland's marimba. The last track on side 1 is the title track, which is by Szabo. This is a great tune. It's built around a very simple vamp in E, and again, I talked earlier on about that droning technique which Szabo uses, very much in evidence here. Side 2 starts with Flea Market, which alternates between this sweet little melody and this short but quite groovy piece of improv. Walk On By is next. This is the Bacharach tune, which is covered so spectacularly a couple of years later by Isaac Hayes. The next song is If I Fell by Lennon and McCartney from the Hard Day's Night soundtrack. Arguably, well, certainly it has to be in the top 5 most beautiful things that Lennon and McCartney ever wrote. But somehow or other, the improv seems really incongruous with respect to the melody. The arrangement just doesn't really work. The next track, however, offers some redemption. It's called Gypsy Jam. This is by Szabo, too. This is way better. Szabo is totally feeling the rhythm of this the way that he wasn't in the previous track. It's apparently composed in the studio. They just needed another track to fill this up. The last track is I'm All Smiles, which is a movie number by Martin and Leonard. It's nice, inoffensive. So this record is early in the journey for McFarland and Szabo. I think it'd be a stretch to call this edgy, but there are some exciting moments. McFarland always toyed a little bit right near the boundary of schmaltz. Sometimes puts his foot over it, usually stays on the right side. But here, sometimes that instinct gets the better of him. There's also, I think, better to come from Szabo. I don't find his playing as assertive and confident as it is in some of his later records to come, such as the quirky and brilliant album Jazz Raga. It's not quite at that level yet, but this is still a highly enjoyable listen, and it whets your appetite for the next installment. For me, this record's 4 out of 5 stars.